Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Anthony Hayes never expected a simple property dispute to turn into a war. What started as a petty rivalry with his arrogant neighbor Henry Larson soon spiraled into vandalism, corruption, and a ruthless battle for justice. But Henry had no idea. Anthony wasn't the kind of man to back down. Anthony Hayes had high hopes when he moved into his new home. A successful architect in his mid-40s, he had spent years saving up for a spacious suburban property where he could enjoy peace and privacy. The house was everything he had wanted, modern, well-maintained, with a large yard that promised endless opportunities for relaxation and customization. But from the very first day, one thing unsettled him: his neighbor, Henry Larson. Henry was in his late 50s, a retired military man with a stiff posture and an intense gaze that made every conversation feel like an interrogation. He had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 2 decades and clearly considered himself its unofficial gatekeeper. Anthony sensed that Henry didn't take kindly to change, and his suspicions were confirmed the moment their paths crossed. The initial disagreement between them was almost laughable in its triviality. It started with a compost bin, just a simple wooden container Anthony placed near the fence line, meant for organic waste. He had always been environmentally conscious and saw no harm in setting up a small composting area in an unused corner of his yard. However, Henry thought otherwise. One afternoon, as Anthony was watering his newly planted shrubs, Henry marched over with the air of a man delivering a military briefing. "That thing stinks," he stated bluntly, pointing at the compost bin. Anthony blinked. "It's compost, Henry. It's natural decomposition." "It's a pest magnet," Henry countered, "and it's too close to my property." Anthony considered the argument absurd, but not wanting to start a war over something so minor, agreed to move the bin a few feet away. He even made an effort to seal it better, ensuring there was no noticeable odor. He assumed that would be the end of it. He was wrong. A few days later, the bin had mysteriously moved back to its original position. Anthony was certain he hadn't done it. He frowned, but instead of confronting Henry directly, he decided to conduct a little experiment. That night, he discreetly shifted the bin once more, this time slightly farther from the fence. The next morning, it had returned to its former spot as if by magic. The message was clear. Deciding to fight petty fire with petty fire, Anthony retaliated in a subtle but deliberate manner. He lined the fence with thorny rose bushes, planting them exactly at the property line. Henry, who obsessively maintained his pristine lawn, would now have to contend with sharp, unwelcome greenery if he dared meddle with the compost bin again. Henry responded in kind. The next morning, Anthony awoke to the roar of a lawnmower at 6 in the morning. Henry, wearing noise-canceling earmuffs, was trimming his grass mere inches from Anthony's bedroom window. The message was unmistakable. The silent war escalated. Anthony installed motion-activated floodlights, strategically angled so that they shone directly into Henry's bedroom window at night. A few days later, Henry retaliated with a drone buzzing over Anthony's yard at random hours, seemingly inspecting every inch of his property. Anthony finally had enough. Armed with a high-pressure water hose, he blasted the drone out of the sky one morning while sipping coffee on his porch. The drone crashed onto Henry's lawn, sputtering and short-circuiting. Henry stepped outside, surveyed the wreckage, and for the first time grinned. "Well played," he muttered, picking up the remains of his drone. Anthony smirked. "Next time, try knocking." To an outsider, their exchanges might have seemed ridiculous. 2 grown men engaging in an escalating battle of stubbornness. But beneath the humor and childish pranks, a real hostility was brewing. Neither of them was willing to back down, and this was only the beginning. The uneasy truce between Anthony and Henry didn't last long. If anything, the downed drone had only fueled their silent war, turning what had once been minor territorial squabbles into a full-blown battle of wits. Neither man would admit it, but they were now fully committed to one-upping each other at every turn. Anthony's patience started wearing thin the day he discovered his car covered in paint splatters. It wasn't a full-on act of vandalism, no slashed tires, no broken windows, but someone had deliberately spilled white paint over his sleek black sedan. He stood in the driveway, jaw tightening as he stared at the mess. The way the paint had dripped suggested it had been done at night, and the most likely suspect lived just across the fence. Taking a deep breath, Anthony knocked on Henry's door. He wasn't going to accuse the man outright. He wasn't that reckless, but he was going to make it clear that he wasn't an easy target. Henry opened the door, wiping his hands with a grease-stained rag. He was working on his truck, an old but well-maintained Ford parked in the driveway. "Morning, neighbor," Henry said, an almost imperceptible smirk on his face. Anthony gestured toward his car. "Wouldn't happen to know anything about this, would you?" Henry leaned over the fence, pretending to inspect the damage. "Oh, wow, that's a shame. Kids these days, huh?" Anthony narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, kids." Henry just grinned and went back to his truck. That was the moment Anthony knew. The war had officially gone beyond passive-aggressive antics. That night, Anthony fought back in his own way. He installed high-powered floodlights along his property, aimed directly at Henry's house. The moment motion was detected, the entire area would light up like a prison yard, bathing Henry's home in blinding white light. At exactly 2 a.m., Anthony heard an angry shout from next door. He peeked through the curtains just in time to see Henry stumbling outside in his pajamas, shielding his eyes from the floodlights. "Turn that damn thing off!" Henry roared, voice echoing in the silent street. Anthony, sipping his beer, smiled. "Motion activated. Can't help it if there's movement." The following day, Henry escalated further. At precisely 6 a.m., the unrelenting sound of a leaf blower filled the air. Henry, wearing noise-canceling headphones, stood at the edge of his property, blowing dust and leaves directly onto Anthony's freshly cleaned driveway. It was clear he was enjoying himself. Anthony clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to charge over and rip the damn thing out of Henry's hands. Instead, he came up with a better plan. A few days later, a large landscaping truck arrived at Anthony's property. The crew worked quickly, setting up an irrigation system, one that included a row of timed sprinklers along the fence line. These sprinklers had a very specific schedule: 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes before Henry's usual lawn routine. That morning, Henry marched outside, leaf blower in hand, ready to make his point. The moment he crossed the fence line, a jet of freezing water sprayed directly into his face. Anthony, sipping his coffee from the porch, called out, "Whoops, guess I overwatered." Henry wiped his face, glaring. "Real mature, Hayes." "You started it, Larson." The war continued. Henry responded with a radio blaring classic rock at max volume, timed perfectly to disrupt Anthony's late-night work calls. Anthony retaliated by ordering a dozen lawn flamingos and placing them strategically along the property line, all facing Henry's house like an army of pink plastic warriors. But neither of them knew that these petty skirmishes were nothing compared to what was coming. Because Henry was about to cross a line that would turn their feud into an all-out battle. The turning point in their feud came unexpectedly. Anthony had taken a weekend trip out of town, hoping that a few days away would help him cool off from the ongoing war of pettiness with Henry. He returned late Sunday evening, exhausted but ready to put his feet up, only to freeze mid-step as he pulled into his driveway. There was a fence. Not just any fence, a 6-foot-tall, industrial-grade, corrugated metal fence that stretched across the side of his property, cutting into his land by several feet. It was imposing, ugly, and entirely out of place in their otherwise suburban neighborhood. Anthony's eyes widened in disbelief. He parked his car and stepped out, his pulse hammering in his ears. As he approached the fence, his stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated move. And then, from his porch, Henry appeared. The man leaned against his railing, sipping coffee from a mug that read, "Neighborhood Watch, always watching." He smirked, eyes twinkling with amusement as he surveyed Anthony's reaction. "Welcome home," Henry called out. "Like what I've done with the place." Anthony clenched his fists. "Are you out of your damn mind?" Henry took another sip of coffee, shrugging. "Just securing what's mine." Anthony took a slow breath, trying to keep himself from ripping that smug grin off Henry's face. "This isn't your land. You know that. You built a fence on my property." Henry waved a dismissive hand. "Nah, see, thing is, I've been using that part of the yard for years. And you're new here. You don't know the history. Property lines shift." Anthony barked a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's not how property works, Larson." Henry tilted his head. "Well, unless you've got some real proof, it looks like that land's mine now." Anthony felt his eye twitch. He did have proof. The official property survey he had received when purchasing the house was sitting in his filing cabinet, but Henry knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't about ownership. This was about power, about who could push the other further. Something inside Anthony snapped. Without thinking, he charged forward. Henry barely had time to set down his coffee before Anthony slammed into him, knocking them both backward onto the damp grass. What followed was a clumsy, ridiculous, rage-fueled scuffle, the kind usually reserved for drunk idiots outside a bar at closing time. Henry managed to hook his leg around Anthony's, sending them both tumbling into a pile of overturned lawn chairs. Anthony, fueled by pure frustration, grabbed a handful of Henry's shirt and yanked, only for the fabric to rip clean off, leaving Henry flailing in nothing but his undershirt. Henry retaliated by grabbing Anthony's ankle, attempting to flip him over, but instead, they both ended up rolling directly into a muddy flower bed. For a moment, they just lay there, covered in dirt, panting, glaring at each other like two kids who had just gotten caught fighting at recess. Then, from across the street, someone whistled. Anthony turned his head slightly to see their neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, standing on her porch, phone in hand, recording the entire thing. "Y'all boys need a hose," she called, trying and failing to suppress a grin. Anthony groaned, rolling onto his back. Henry spat out a bit of dirt and chuckled breathlessly. "Well, that was stupid," Henry admitted. Anthony sat up, rubbing his sore shoulder. "Yeah, but I'm still getting rid of that damn fence." Henry smirked. "We'll see about that." As they both struggled to their feet, soaked and covered in mud, Anthony knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Anthony barely got a wink of sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that god-awful metal fence standing there like a monument to Henry's arrogance. The scuffle in the mud had only added insult to injury. Henry clearly thought this was all just another round in their long-running game, but this time, it wasn't about pettiness. It was about his land. And Anthony wasn't about to let this go. The first thing he did in the morning, after washing off the remnants of last night's dirt and bruised pride, was dig out his property documents. The survey map confirmed what he already knew. Henry had stolen 5 feet of his land. 5 feet might not sound like much, but it was the principle. If Henry got away with this, who knew what he'd try next? But Anthony wasn't just going to confront him again. No, that hadn't gotten him anywhere. Instead, he was going to build a case so solid that Henry wouldn't have a leg to stand on. Anthony had already been thinking about getting a surveillance system, but now it was priority number 1. By the afternoon, a professional installation crew was setting up multiple motion-activated cameras across his property. Night vision, high resolution, cloud storage. If Henry so much as breathed in the wrong direction, Anthony would have it on tape. And sure enough, the cameras delivered results almost immediately. That very evening, as Anthony sat at his desk reviewing the footage, he saw exactly what he needed, a time-stamped video showing Henry supervising a group of workers as they installed the fence. Not only was Henry caught on camera standing on Anthony's property, but he could also be heard saying, "Don't worry, it's mine now, just put it up." Anthony smirked. Gotcha. The next step was understanding his opponent. As he stared at the fence, something clicked in his memory. The previous homeowners had warned him about Henry. They'd mentioned that he was territorial and had caused trouble before. At the time, Anthony hadn't thought much of it. Now he wanted details. He found their old contact information and called them up. What he learned made his blood boil. He wasn't Henry's first target. The previous owners had gone through the same nightmare, but Henry had used intimidation tactics, threats of lawsuits, fake complaints to the city, and flat-out bullying to get his way. Eventually, they gave up, opting to sell the house instead of fighting him. And it wasn't just them. With a little digging, Anthony discovered several other neighbors who had fallen victim to Henry's land-grabbing schemes. Most had been too scared to take legal action. Those who tried were quickly shut down, and rumors swirled that Henry had connections with local officials, judges, code inspectors, even police officers, who helped sweep things under the rug. Anthony wasn't just up against a bad neighbor, he was up against a system that had been enabling him for years. Determined to expose Henry for what he was, Anthony created a group chat and invited everyone who had suffered under him. At first, people were hesitant, fearful that speaking up would only make things worse. But when Anthony shared his surveillance footage showing Henry stealing land in real time, the tide started to turn. One by one, the stories poured in. A family who had mysteriously lost a portion of their backyard after Henry helped them replace their fence. An elderly couple who had been fined repeatedly after Henry reported them for violations that didn't exist. A woman who had been threatened with legal action when she refused to sell him a portion of her property. The group exploded with activity. People who had once felt alone in their struggles found strength in numbers. Then, an unexpected message popped up from a new number. "I have proof of corruption. Call me." Anthony's heart pounded. He dialed immediately. The voice on the other end was Jacob Owens, a former private investigator. Turns out Jacob had been hired by another neighbor years ago to dig into Henry's dealings. But before he could finish his work, the neighbor suddenly dropped the case and moved away. Now, Jacob wanted revenge. "That bastard ruined a lot of lives," Jacob said. "If you're serious about taking him down, I can help. But you need to be ready for a fight." Anthony grinned for the first time in days. "Oh, I'm ready." Anthony knew that Henry wouldn't go down without a fight. The moment he started gathering evidence, he expected pushback. And sure enough, Henry wasted no time launching his next attack. It began subtly. An anonymous letter appeared in Anthony's mailbox, typed out in bold capital letters. "Drop it. You don't know who you're dealing with." Anthony scoffed. Really? A cliché intimidation letter? Henry was predictable. But the real escalation came 2 nights later. At exactly 3:12 a.m., Anthony's phone buzzed with an alert from his security cameras. He opened the app and saw a dark figure in a hoodie sneaking up to his mailbox. Within seconds, the person ripped the box off its post and hurled it straight into Anthony's swimming pool. Anthony didn't even have time to react before the figure flipped off the camera and sprinted away, but not before their face was clearly captured in the motion-activated spotlight. It was Henry. The next morning, Anthony woke up to yet another surprise. His fence had been spray-painted with the words "Stay Out" in red letters. The paint was still dripping, but instead of getting mad, Anthony got strategic. Anthony called Jacob, the private investigator, and together they set up a bait operation. They knew Henry wouldn't stop, so they planted fake legal documents in Anthony's mailbox, clearly visible through the slot. A note on top read, "Official court notice. Property dispute case filed." Sure enough, that very night, Henry took the bait. The security footage caught him sneaking onto Anthony's porch, reaching into the mailbox, and stealing the fake documents. The next morning, Anthony marched straight to the police station. With video evidence of vandalism, theft, and trespassing, Henry was now officially a criminal suspect. And the best part? Anthony wasn't done yet. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers filled the benches, whispering amongst themselves. The case had gone from a simple property dispute to a full-blown scandal, and everyone wanted to witness Henry Larson's downfall. At the defendant's table, Henry sat stiff-backed, dressed in an ill-fitting suit that did nothing to hide the sweat beading on his forehead. He had walked in with his usual arrogance, expecting the judge to be one of his longtime friends in the system, someone who would brush the case aside and maybe even scold Anthony for wasting the court's time. But the moment the judge entered, Henry's expression visibly shifted from smugness to pure, unfiltered panic. Because it wasn't his judge. Henry's head snapped toward his lawyer, his lips moving in a silent but unmistakable question. Who the hell is this? Across the courtroom, Anthony sat calmly, a satisfied smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Jacob Owens, the private investigator, had done his job. With his connections, Jacob had ensured that Henry's usual friends wouldn't be the ones presiding over the case. Instead, the judge today was a hard-nosed, by-the-book federal appointee with zero tolerance for corruption. And Henry was screwed. The judge settled in, adjusted his glasses, and flipped through the case file. Then he looked up, his gaze landing on Henry like a sledgehammer. "Mr. Larson," the judge said, his tone cold, "I hope you're prepared to explain yourself." Henry gulped. Henry's lawyer made a feeble attempt to paint this as a petty neighborhood dispute, blown out of proportion. "My client misunderstood the property lines," the lawyer insisted, forcing a grin. "It was an honest mistake." "An honest mistake?" Anthony's lawyer interrupted, rising from his seat. "Let's take a look at that." He nodded toward the large monitor set up in the courtroom, where high-resolution security footage began playing for everyone to see. The entire room watched as Henry personally supervised the construction of the illegal fence, pointing and instructing workers exactly where to build it, on Anthony's land. Henry shifted in his seat, gripping the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then came the next clip. Henry sneaking onto Anthony's property in the middle of the night, ripping his mailbox off and hurling it into the pool. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's brow furrowed deeply. But it wasn't over yet. Next, the footage showed Henry stealing what he believed were Anthony's legal documents, confirming that he wasn't just a bully, he was actively trying to manipulate the case against him. "Does that look like a misunderstanding to you, Mr. Larson?" the judge asked, his voice like a razor blade. Henry's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He glanced desperately at his lawyer, but the man was already wiping his forehead with a trembling hand. Then Anthony's lawyer delivered the final blow. "We would also like to call a witness," he announced, turning toward the back of the courtroom. "Jacob Owens, private investigator." Henry's face drained of all color. Jacob walked up to the stand, calm and confident. He introduced himself and then revealed what he had uncovered: years of property disputes, false complaints, and intimidation tactics, all linked back to Henry Larson. But the real bombshell came when Jacob produced a recording, an audio clip of Henry talking to a city official about how to make this problem disappear. "You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Just bury the report. No one needs to know." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Reporters were scribbling furiously, some whispering about the possible involvement of local government corruption. The judge's face hardened. "Enough," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. He turned his gaze to Henry, who looked like he was about to be sick. "Mr. Larson, your arrogance and blatant disregard for the law are astounding. You not only trespassed and vandalized someone's property, but you also engaged in fraudulent activity and attempted to manipulate the legal system for personal gain. And now," he gestured toward Jacob, "we have reason to believe you were part of a much larger scheme involving corruption in local government." Henry shrank in his chair. He knew there was no way out. "I am ordering," the judge continued, "an immediate investigation into your connections with local officials. I'm also issuing the full removal of the illegal fence, a hefty fine for damages and legal fees, and an immediate restraining order against you, Mr. Larson. Furthermore," the judge's tone sharpened, "I am forwarding this case to the district attorney's office for criminal proceedings." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Henry sagged in his seat, utterly defeated. He had thought he was untouchable. He had been wrong. As the judge slammed the gavel, officially closing the case, Henry's worst nightmare began. The press was already rushing out to report the corruption scandal, and court officers approached him with stern expressions, ready to escort him out. Anthony stood, adjusting his jacket, feeling an overwhelming sense of victory. As Henry was led away, humiliated, Anthony caught his eye and smirked. "Guess property lines do matter, huh?" Henry scowled but said nothing. This wasn't just a win. It was a reckoning. The fallout from the trial was swift and merciless. Henry's name was plastered across every news channel, headlines branding him as the mastermind behind a web of local corruption. But the true moment of satisfaction came for Anthony the following week, as he was driving home from the grocery store. He turned on the radio, casually flipping through stations, when a familiar name made his ears perk up. Breaking news. Following last week's shocking court case involving Henry Larson's illegal land grabs, authorities have arrested multiple city officials, including former Judge William Hargrove and several code enforcement officers. Evidence suggests they were involved in years of fraudulent property dealings and intimidation schemes. Formal charges include bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. All suspects are now in custody, awaiting trial. Anthony nearly swerved off the road from laughing. They got them. The entire fraud protection network that had shielded Henry for years had collapsed like a house of cards. But the true final nail in the coffin came the day Henry was forced to remove the fence. A demolition crew arrived, supervised by court officials, neighbors, and, much to Henry's horror, a local news crew broadcasting the entire event live. Anthony stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching with pure amusement as Henry, looking miserable and humiliated, had no choice but to watch his precious fence come down piece by piece. But then, the icing on the cake happened. As Henry turned away, muttering curses, one of the workers accidentally knocked over a stack of metal panels, directly onto Henry's foot. The entire crowd winced as Henry let out a pained yelp, hopping on one leg, swearing loudly on live TV. Anthony couldn't hold back a grin. Justice had never felt so satisfying.